All right, welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Sunday, February 16th, 2025. And on Sundays, we talk about the purpose and meaning of life. I'm in a different location, but I'm committed to pursuing this vlog series. And so today we're going to be talking about love thy neighbor. And one of the cultural universals that appears seemingly everywhere on the planet then involves the love that parents express for their children. That love might be shown quite differently according to the various cultural traditions. For example, in most North American cultures, we commonly expect our parents to bathe their children with loving embraces and verbalizing, I love you, on a regular basis. In contrast, I had a couple of students from China in a fourth year seminar on domestic violence last year, and I asked them about uh, their families and about their expressions of love, how their parents would typically show their love for their children or express it in Mandarin in these cases. And so both individuals, a male and a female, agreed that they just didn't typically use the phrase as we would use it, I love you, or that parents didn't express I love you to their children or vice versa. But instead, the woman explained that what you would do is show your love for your parents through honoring them through with your presence, through following through with your commitments and the obligations of fulfilling your duties. That's how you expressed love. You would only say "I love you" in again the kind of the literal equivalence in Mandarin if you were in a kind of life-threatening situation. Um, and you didn't expect to survive, then you might, as a sort of dying wish, express that to your parents. And then what about non-family members? The idea of loving others beyond one's immediate family is an even uh, more nuanced position in cultures, and there are different contingencies that must be taken into account, especially in light of our tribal nature as Homo sapiens. But interestingly, the evidence seems to suggest that even amongst simpler societies of hunter gatherers, there's typically an imperative to be respectful of all aspects of nature. Many practice some form of animism in terms of their spiritual understanding of nature and how they relate to nature in general. And accompanying that, there's typically some kind of a mandate to help those in need. And furthermore, the environmental challenges that often make life a little bit precarious, or might make life somewhat precarious, demands that a certain degree of cooperation should exist as well, especially in terms of the immediate family members and the tribe as a whole, to help ensure or for the benefit of the survival of the entire group. There's often even evidence of significant intertribal cooperation as well, that is extending beyond the tribe. And that's an interesting commentary in terms of the degree to which hunter gatherers or peoples living in simpler societies also might express some kind of degree of affection or maybe not in our terms, but some kind of love and support of their neighbors. So, by the same token, very few people live in hunter-gatherer society or horticultural societies these days. And indeed, nearly everyone lives in either agricultural, industrial, or advanced industrial societies the world over. And so, in that sense, most of these societies have well-established philosophical principles and practices that articulate the nature of God and the importance of some concept of love for oneself, one's family, and one's neighbors. And so, as best I can determine, the most enlightened religious and secular thought leaders across our more complex cultures have developed philosophies that articulate something along the lines of the following. That is, that the ultimate oneness of humankind prevails, whether we recognize that in our everyday lives or not. There's a generally agreed upon or shared commitment to human flourishing. again, expressed different ways through various cultural practices, and even a kind of universal love of our fellow human beings. And so I just want to share briefly some of the primary lessons that the different major faith traditions and even amongst the secular humanists and agnostics and atheists, they all have some sense of otherness or other directedness included as part of their morality. So, for example, Christians would argue that God's love should serve as a model or is the model for genuine love, whereby love should be directed first and foremost at God, but then by the same token that Christians or the dictate is that Christians everywhere should love those around them as well. According to John the Apostle, anyone who doesn't love or doesn't know God. John 4:8. Love thus represents the distinguishing feature of true Christians, at least in my understanding. And so according to the biblical scripture, John 13:34-35, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And of course, John commands further to love each other as I, Jesus, have loved you, or he reports on that, I should say, quoting Jesus. And from Mark 12:31, we are taught to love your neighbor as yourself. Indeed, there are countless affirmations of love throughout the Bible, especially in the New Testament. From a Muslim perspective, love of God is the most fundamental teaching of Islam. To give just one citation, the Quran 2:165, and yet there are people who choose to believe in beings that allegedly rival God, loving them as only God should be loved, whereas those who have attained faith love God more than all else. So again, the stress there's on the primacy of loving God. Muslims borrow extensively from Christian traditions and claim that, quote, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, how can he love God, whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. And also, according to Quran 4:36, quote, serve Allah and join not any partners with him, and do good to parents, kinsfolk, orphans, those in need, neighbors who are near, neighbors who are strangers, the companion by your side, the wayfarer ye meet. Okay? Quoting further, verily God does not love any of those who, full of self-conceit, act in a boastful manner, nor those who are niggardly and bid others to be niggardly, again meaning stingy or ungenerous, and conceal whatever God has bestowed upon him out of his bounty. And so we have readied shameful suffering for all who thus deny truth. Muslims argue, too, that it's necessary to show mercy and compassion for others, or else God will bestow no mercy upon humans. The Prophet said, quote, God has no mercy on those who are not merciful toward the people. And the Sufis, end quote. So then the Sufis, too, among Muslims, extend that logic, that belief even further, or love as a path to God. So Sufis believe that the ultimate goal of spiritual practice is to attain divine love, and loving others is a crucial step along that pathway. And indeed, through Ishq, Sufis see unity and perceive all creation as interconnected. And so hence loving one another is essentially loving a part of God. And then there's Judaism. In Hebrew, the first words of the Shema prayer, the oldest fixed daily prayer in Judaism, recited morning and evening, expresses love for God first and foremost. But that must be extended as well to your fellow human beings. You have, of course, the importance of the Old Testament with expressions such as in Leviticus 19:18, quote, "Don't take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people. Rather, love your neighbor as yourself," end quote. And in Judaism, there's the famous account in the Talmud, Shabbat 31a, that deals with a Gentile who wanted to convert to Judaism. The individual stated that he would accept Judaism, I should say, only if a rabbi would teach him the entire Torah, as he, the prospective convert, stood on one foot. Kind of a fascinating story. And so first he went to Shammai, who was insulted by the request and threw him out of his house. The man, however, didn't give up. He went to Hillel, a gentle sage who accepted the challenge and said, quote, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is the explanation of this. So go and study it," end quote. And so, despite the differences in terms of their holy books, the scriptures across the Jewish, the Christian, and Muslim teachings, they all seem to be largely consistent with one another, at least with respect to showing loving kindness towards thy neighbor. And that's perhaps due in part to the fact that they are all three religions, or all three of them have a common denominator in terms of the worship of one God. And there are certainly other differences, but the Abrahamic faiths essentially share this core aspect, and it's an important defining feature. But what I find most interesting is that, again, you can pick or find all sorts of contradictions in the different holy books, and where they're saying one thing one day or in one verse, and then something almost entirely opposite the next. And there's quite a bit of judgment that's involved in these different religious traditions, but they all seem to share a common belief in the importance of, obviously, of loving God first and foremost, but also in sharing that love or extending that love to thy neighbor. And this is true elsewhere too. So in Hinduism, for example, the concept of loving each other is deeply rooted in the idea of all beings being interconnected, part of the divine Brahman. And by loving others, then you're basically loving the divine within themselves and within yourself. And the idea is captured in the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family, that notion. And that's, again, considered to be a core of Hindu ethics. And the complementary practice of ahimsa, nonviolence, also contributes to the concept of universal love. And Buddhists have developed similar themes as well. And then there's samples from secular humanists and agnostics and atheists. So secular humanism, for example, extols the love thy neighbor concept by promoting ethical behavior and compassion towards others, even without relying on a deity or religious doctrine per se. So secular humanists generally encourage treating others with kindness and respect, regardless of their beliefs. And that's, again, a core value of a harmonious society from their perspective. And most agnostics and atheists argue from a similar kind of philosophical perspective, embracing, again, the idea of loving thy neighbor through empathy, compassion, and with the intention of creating harmony. But again, without reference to a deity per se. So I guess all of this leads me then to ask yourselves and myself as well, what's our general worldview then? What are we to make of all of these different approaches, the different religions, the different humanistic perspectives, even the atheists? As a general principle, what would be your personal philosophy or worldview? In other words, does a universal love of humanity resonate with your particular moral vision? Or do you reject that out of hand or a priori because of our tribal natures as Homo sapiens and the seemingly ubiquitous nature of human conflict, aggression, violence, and wars throughout history. So, in light of your own experience, personal preferences, your self-interest as you see it, what would your ideal world look like? If you were omnipotent and omniscient, that is, all powerful and all knowing, what would you like to see happen in terms of human coexistence and cooperation? What ideas lie at the core of your moral philosophy? We almost certainly all have them. What would those be? You should even consider writing them down or typing them out if you haven't done so previously, just to be clear in your own mind. And indeed, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that you have just landed on the planet, that is the you now, is some extraterrestrial, that is, an enlightened visionary from an entirely different solar system. Now, for our part, we humans would be absolutely awestruck at your arrival, an actual, real-life extraterrestrial visitor. We're blown away by your uniqueness as a species we hadn't seen previously, didn't know about, obviously. We are also blown away by your knowledge of physics and science in general. We're wonderstruck in learning about the technologies that you possess and have developed and that have allowed you to traverse vast expanses of space at unimaginable speeds just to get here. And we're equally impressed by the fact that you're able to communicate with every single one of us, no matter what our linguistic or cultural backgrounds. So in this experiment, you would be considered virtually a god from our perspective, from the perspective of human beings encountering these types of extraterrestrials. Or you'd be the closest thing that we would have encountered that we could compare to the Marvel universe, or those with the superpowers and so forth. So let's imagine too then that as an ET, actually we don't have to imagine, this would likely be true, but you really never knew anything about human beings. This is your first encounter. And so what would your message be to us Earthlings? What would you imagine? What would be your advice in terms of a moral philosophy that could be applied to managing our affairs? Again, you wouldn't be burdened with the lived experience of human history or the memories and the myths that we as human beings have created. And you're not in the least bit troubled by the fact that we Earthlings have a diverse array of ethno-racial groups, backgrounds, perspectives, and peoples who speak more than 7,000 languages. In short, the most enlightened and advanced species ever to set foot on the planet. If that's you, as this enlightened species, what would be your solution to achieving global cooperation and world peace? Can you even imagine a world in which human beings everywhere might have the opportunity to flourish and to cooperate, to live in peace? Or does that simply lie outside of the realm of possibility in your vision? At the level of your own moral philosophy, do you genuinely acknowledge the dignity of every human being, at least in principle, at least upon meeting them, no matter what their cultural background, no matter what their station in life? Or do you automatically have a certain distaste, maybe even disdain for certain kinds of people, those from different tribes, different heritages, different religions? Of course, if you were that ET, it'd be very hard, if not impossible, to have such biases, right? It's a whole new experience. So, I'd ask you to try to be completely honest with yourself, based on your current lived experiences, who you are, what you've seen in your life. Do you truly prefer to live in a world that's broadly united and able and willing to cooperate? cross ethno-racial, linguistic, and cultural lines? Or do you prefer to live in a world, or have you concluded that we can only live in a world divided across certain lines because of who we are, because of human nature? So, in your judgment, is it inevitable that everyone will mainly compete with one another and look out for their own interest and the interest of their particular tribes? Obviously, I don't know where you stand personally. I've just asked you to engage in the thought experiment, to take a good, long, hard look at yourself to see what you really think about these things. Um, and I'm asking you to do this because I'm also confident that our thoughts are often a precursor to our actions, and that what we believe often then ends up being translated into some kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if your lived experience then has convinced you that humans are ultimately just too selfish or too flawed or too tribal, uh, and that we live in a world with limited and scarce resources, it's hard to imagine following moral philosophies touted by the great thinkers across the different traditions that I've mentioned, at least without compromise. So, at the very least, many peoples will then end up bending the rules or creating different kinds of justifications to allow themselves to qualify what counts as loving thy neighbor and even which neighbors. And even more commonly, the pattern seems to be that human beings are really good at creating rules and finding exceptions within their contingent moral philosophies that allows them then to exclude others, to isolate, hate, even eliminate the other, the unwanted neighbor. So, in summation, I actually don't know that many people who are truly and deeply uh, invested in the commandment, love thy neighbor. Even more powerfully, I can almost guarantee you that each of these individuals, and that's probably the majority, the clear majority, that they each have their reasons. They have their justifications rooted in their own personal experiences and the stories that they've created to comfort themselves and their own kind. It's also why I've always felt like a bit of an odd duck, insofar as I've always tried to align myself as part of one kind as well, the human kind. My allegiances have always transcended the narrower kinds with which most people tend to identify. And there are people, by the way, who quite frankly hate me as a result, or at least they seriously disagree with my views and they think that I'm fundamentally wrong. And so, as with my other vlogs, I'll suggested that that's kind of the greatest challenge then, that is to love your haters, your detractors, even those who would hurt you. So I won't delve further into that or how we reconcile a love for humankind and our love for our brothers and sisters and our love for our neighbors, that's intended to be universal, and at the same time how we have to at times protect ourselves from serious and immediate threats and that sort of thing, right? As I've said in other vlogs, you can't, it's very difficult to say I love you when somebody's beating you to death or hurting you. So there are obviously tensions and ways of managing our love for others or that universal love in light of certain lived circumstances. But even then, the key is to protect oneself. That's vastly different than saying I'm going to condemn these people, these individuals, or this whole group of people because I find them morally objectionable on whatever grounds we come up with. So, yeah, it's a challenge to love thy neighbor. Uh, but as I say, to my way of thinking, based on all of the great religious traditions and the secular traditions, indeed, that's our main purpose in life, if you will. I mean, if you're a believer in God, or your spirituality may direct you to believe or to love God first and foremost, uh, the secularist amongst us or the atheist and agnostics wouldn't put it that way. But regardless of your perspective, almost all would agree, again, within the broader kind of philosophical traditions, that loving thy neighbor and coming to terms with that deeply rooted sense of commitment and connection to one another, that lies at the heart of the golden rule and how we can try to create a planet full of diverse peoples who somehow, miraculously perhaps, seem to be able to get along with one another, seem to be able to cooperate, seem to be able to transcend that animal and that tribal nature that certainly exists within all of us. So in future vlogs, I'll talk about how we can actually achieve that, despite the many roadblocks, the barriers, and the millions, perhaps billions of people who think differently in this regard. So it ain't easy. Uh, that's what Ringo used to sing too. It don't come easy. But I'm going to suggest that it's possible. And at the very least, you can live your life in a way that's consistent with it, that aligns with a much deeper and transcendent moral philosophy. Okay, well, that's it. So aloha, mahalo, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Oh, sorry, I forgot my sign up. In the meantime, as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts.